The rifle. It was supposed to clean itself. On a bare hill above Sanh, that promise got Marines killed. That was the deal. Nothing to scrub, nothing to strip, nothing to carry but rifle and rounds. Late April 1967, Hill 881 North. Marines who had carried it a few weeks climbed into the fire, and partway up, it quit. A spent case, welded into a hot chamber. The only way to clear it, a steel rod down the muzzle, punching the case out by hand, while the Hill fired back. They were found where they fell. Rifle stripped open across the knees, a rod down the barrel. The self-cleaning rifle, cleaned by hand, under fire, by men who did not live to finish. 155 Marines died in those hills that spring. Some of them died with both hands on a rifle that would not clear. The Army knew the rifle could do this, warned, on paper, before a Marine ever reached that hill. It fielded the weapon anyway. Wrapped in the promise, it cleaned itself. Not the story of a bad rifle. Eugene Stoner built a good one. This is what the Army did to it after he handed it over. 3 choices, made in offices back home. The Marines on Hill 881 paid for all 3, one jammed round at a time. Start with the rifle before the Army touched it. In the late 1950s, in a small California shop called ArmaLite, a self-taught engineer named Eugene Stoner built a rifle out of aluminum and plastic. Men laughed at it. It weighed almost nothing. It looked like a toy. It fired a small, fast round that did terrible damage for its size. It worked. Stoner built the whole thing around something you cannot see: powder. He tuned the gas system, the tube that cycles the action, to one specific propellant, an extruded stick powder from DuPont, sold under the name IMR. It burned clean. It left almost nothing behind. The rifle ran light and fast because it ran clean, and it ran clean because of the powder he built it around. The Air Force bought it first. May 1962, 8,500 rifles for guard and security units. Another 19,000 the following April. The Air Force Chief of Staff, Curtis LeMay, wanted them. The Army bought 338 for testing. That number is the whole story, because the Army already had a rifle. It was called the M14. Not just the Army's rifle, it was the Ordnance Establishment's own child. The last small arm designed at Springfield Armory, the government's own gun factory. In service since 1957, wood and steel, full-power cartridge, built by the institution, for the institution, in the institution's own building. The AR-15 was something else entirely to those men, an outsider's design. Plastic, made by a commercial company they did not control, championed by a rival service, and being pushed at them from above by a Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and his statisticians, who had a habit of telling career officers that the numbers disagreed with them. The Army tested the 2 rifles against each other. In December of 1962, the Secretary of the Army ordered the Inspector General to investigate how those tests had been run. Here is what the investigation found sitting in the files. A memorandum for the record, written by the representative of the U.S. Army Infantry Board. It concerned a planning conference at Army Materiel Command Headquarters, October 1962. One sentence in it reads, "The U.S. Army Infantry Board will conduct only those tests that will reflect adversely on the AR-15 rifle, plus other tests that may be considered appropriate." That is not a leaked memo. It is not a rumor. It is a document the Army's own Inspector General pulled out of the Army's own files. And it says the quiet part in writing. Everyone who had attended that meeting was questioned. All of them denied it under oath. Every one. The colonel responsible explained that the sentence was not what he had meant to write and could only have got there through administrative error, a typo. Be fair here. The Inspector General did not conclude the tests were rigged. He concluded something worse and more institutional. The way the tests were run, he found, was fair, impartial, and objective. It was the judging that was not. The evaluation of the data, the writing of the reports, the attitudes of the men doing both, all of it tended to favor the M14. The details have a certain flavor, An officer telephoned and suggested the AR-15 be given a particular rain test. The AR-15 was given it. It failed. The failure went into the report. The M14 was never given that test. When one M14 started shooting badly in the middle of the lethality trial, it was quietly swapped for another M14, and the test carried on. Years later, going through all of this, the subcommittee dropped one footnote into its own narrative of the Army's testing. One footnote. The committee takes note also of the NIH, not invented here, attitude. Meanwhile, McNamara's own analysts in the Pentagon Comptroller's Office had run their own comparison. Their verdict, September 1962, the AR-15 was decidedly superior in many of the factors considered. In none of them was the M14 superior. The answer had existed the whole time. It usually is. The decision went the way outsiders' decisions go when the Secretary of Defense is the outsider. In November 1963, the Army signed its first production contract. 104,000 rifles, 85,000 of them for the Army that had just spent a year trying to prove the thing was no good. The institution now responsible for this rifle, for its specifications, its ammunition, its modifications, was the institution that had wanted it to fail. In March 1963, the Army set up the body that would run the rifle. It was called the Technical Coordinating Committee. A lieutenant colonel named Harold Yount was made project manager, under Army Weapons Command, under Army Materiel Command. That is the room. Everything that follows happened in it, or was signed off by someone sitting in it. 3 decisions came out of that room. Take them one at a time, because each one is small, defensible, and lethal. The first was a device. Before the first production contract was even awarded, the Army insisted on adding a plunger to the side of the rifle, a manual bolt closure, what we now call the forward assist. Its purpose was simple. When the bolt does not go fully closed, you hit the plunger and force it closed. The Air Force objected. The Navy called it non-essential. So did the Marine Corps. Colt, the manufacturer, took the position that it was not necessary. Stoner, asked directly, said he had considered it and did not find it necessary with the free-floating bolt. The designer, the manufacturer, 3 of the 4 services, all on one side. The Air Force put its objection in writing. This is the sentence. During operation of the AR-15 rifle and other handheld weapons, it has been found that it is not advisable to attempt to manually force the bolt of a weapon closed when a malfunction occurs. Forcing the bolt closed, driving live ammunition into the chamber, not only aggravates the malfunction, but is also a dangerous practice. Then the Air Force twisted the knife politely in the next line. The recommended procedure, it noted, is to pull the bolt to the rear and eject the bad round. The U.S. Army's own training manuals for the M1 and for the M14 say exactly that. Do not force the bolt closed. In 1963, in writing, the Air Force had to remind the Army of the Army's own manuals. The device the Army was demanding did the one thing those manuals told soldiers never to do. It went in anyway. $4.53 on every Army rifle for years. That is why 2 rifles walked out of the same factory. The Air Force carried the M16, clean-sighted, no plunger. The Army and the Marines carried the M16E1, with the plunger the Army had insisted on. 4 years later, it was standardized as the M16A1. 4 years later, a congressman asked the project manager to justify it. The exchange is in the record. Was the modification justified on the basis of tests conducted? I was unable to justify it on the basis of prior tests. You state you were not able to justify it on the basis of tests. What were you able to justify it on? On the basis of direction. That is Colonel Harold Yount, in testimony before the subcommittee, telling Congress that the rifle America carried into Vietnam had been modified because somebody upstairs said so. The second decision was the barrel. The Army changed the rifling twist from 1 turn in 14 inches to 1 turn in 12. The stated reason was bullet stability in extreme cold. The effect, according to witnesses before the subcommittee and an internal Army memorandum of February 1967, was to cut the bullet's killing power by as much as 40%. 40% of the round's killing power given up for stability at 65 below zero in a jungle war. Congress noticed. Its verdict on that requirement was dry as bone. The subcommittee questions the validity of a requirement for a rifle to perform identically at -65 degrees and at 125. And the third decision is the one that killed people, the powder. DuPont could not deliver the clean extruded IMR powder in the quantities a war needed. The Army turned to a ball propellant made by Olin Matheson, designated WC-846, and approved it as the substitute. On the spec sheet, close enough. In the rifle Stoner had tuned around a different powder, a different weapon. WC-846 did two things Stoner never designed for. It burned dirty. Part of that was an additive used in manufacture, meant to neutralize the acids in the powder, calcium carbonate. It was never fully removed. It came out when the round burned, coating the chamber and caking the gas tube. And it burned hot, which drove the action faster. Stoner's rifle was meant to cycle at around 850 rounds a minute. On ball powder, it ran closer to 1,000. Faster sounds better. Here is why it is not. Picture the instant after a shot. The bullet is gone. The empty case in the chamber is still swollen tight against the walls, gripping the steel, because the pressure has not fallen yet. In a rifle running at the designed speed, the action waits that extra fraction of a second for the case to let go before it pulls. Run it too fast, and the extractor grabs the case while it is still stuck. It tears straight through the rim, the way a can opener slips off a lid. The bullet is gone. The case stays. Now the rifle is not empty. It is blocked by a piece of itself in a chamber that is hot and filthy. The bolt cannot close on a fresh round because a dead one is welded in the way. The only way to get it out, in the middle of a firefight, is a steel rod, down the muzzle, driving the dead case out by hand. Put yourself in that grass for a second. Your rifle stops. The men above you do not. You roll onto your side, find the two halves of a cleaning rod, screw them together, run the steel down the muzzle, and knock the brass out of the chamber. Then you do it again on the next round, and the one after that. That is the machine. There is one last piece, the one in the title. The men could have fought all of this. Fouling is a maintenance problem, and Marines are extraordinary at maintenance. Give a Marine a rod, a brush, solvent, and half an hour, and he will keep almost anything alive. The rifle did not arrive with a rod, a brush, solvent, or half an hour. It arrived with a promise. Army training publications for the M16 said things like this, that the weapon requires the least maintenance of any weapon in the inventory, that the rifle will fire longer without cleaning or oiling than any other known rifle. The line the Army printed most often, an occasional cleaning will keep the weapon functioning indefinitely. Congress printed those sentences in its report, side by side, under a heading about publications that oversold the rifle. Then it answered them in one flat line. The recent experience in Vietnam tends to refute the above statements. The rifles went to Vietnam with almost no cleaning equipment behind them. In at least one Marine battalion, the commander instructed the armorer to issue one cleaning kit for every 4 men. When a rod broke or was lost, that meant doubling up again. When congressional investigators walked into those units, they asked, none of the enlisted Marines they spoke to had a maintenance pamphlet, a manual, or any written instruction at all. Many had received almost no spoken instruction either. The men had a rifle built to jam and nothing issued to fight it with. Here is the part that turns that from a failure into a choice. March the 24th, 1964. A technical coordinating committee meeting. Colt reports the results of a test. 10 rifles, fired with the new ball powder, 6 of the 10 exceeded the acceptable cyclic rate. The same rifles, fired with the old IMR powder, 1 out of 10. 6 out of 10 failing on the powder the troops would be issued. 1 out of 10 on the powder they would not. Colt asked the committee to raise the acceptance ceiling, the same 850 rounds a minute the rifle was built around, up to 900 for the April deliveries. The service representatives attending the Technical Coordinating Committee concurred. Then they extended the waiver through May, June, July. 12,400 rifles were delivered and accepted under that waiver. Rifles the Army knew did not meet its own operational specification. Congress could find no evidence the Army ever tried to recall them or to check whether they were fit to use. Its own conclusion was flat. It is conceivable that a substantial quantity of these rifles was issued to the troops in Vietnam. Which brings us to the last thing that room did. Colt was allowed to choose the ammunition used to test the rifles it delivered. Colt chose the clean IMR powder. The rifles passed with it. Between December 1966 and the hearings, roughly 330,000 rifles were accepted from Colt by the military. They were certified with a powder the men would never be issued. More than 90% of the ammunition shipped to Vietnam was loaded with ball. The rifles were passing a test the war would not let them take. There was one more fix that never arrived. In December 1966, the Army put a new, heavier buffer into production to slow the action back toward the speed it was designed for. 50,000 of them reached Vietnam. By the time congressional investigators went looking, 12,500 had been handed out. None had reached the Marines. The subcommittee said it could not understand the lackadaisical manner in which it was implemented. There was one more thing: chrome plating in the chamber, which keeps a hot case from fusing to bare steel, and which the Army did eventually pay for. It was approved on the 26th of May, 1967. Hold that date. The 24th of April, 1967, in the hills above a Marine base at Sanh near the border, in the far north of South Vietnam, the hills there are named for their height in meters: 861, 881 north, 881 south. The ground between them is steep, jungled, and covered in elephant grass that stands 8 to 10 feet high enough to walk through blind. Cuts from that grass got infected. Leech bites turned into cellulitis. That morning, a platoon from Company B, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, sent 5 men up the side of Hill 861, an observation team led by 1st Lieutenant Philip Sauer. About 300 meters below the summit, the North Vietnamese were waiting. The point man went down first. Sauer stood up to cover the withdrawal of his men, firing a .45 caliber pistol, and was killed. One man got back, Private First Class William Marks, the mortar observer. His report was 4 words, and then 2 of them again. "They're all dead. The other 4, all dead." The Marine Corps' own history marks that moment as the beginning of the first battle of Sanh. Later that day, a lieutenant named Thomas King took 9 men back up to recover the bodies. He got 2 of them. 2 others had been decapitated and burned. King remembered how quiet it was on that hillside, no bugs making noise. When a helicopter came in for the dead, the whole tree line on the crest opened up at once. The helicopter took 35 bullet holes. It got out. Company B lost 12 killed, 17 wounded, and 2 missing on the first day to take nothing. What the Marines were walking into on those hills was not a firefight. It was engineering. Every man climbing toward it carried a rifle that could stop working on the first magazine. When Hill 881 South finally fell, the Marines counted about 250 enemy bunkers on it. The small ones had 2 layers of logs and up to 5 feet of dirt on the roof. The big ones had 4 to 8 layers of logs. Inside, there were storage shelves, bamboo mat floors, drainage. They were dug and sited so well that an observer could not spot one until he was inside 40 yards of it. The Marines hit that hill with everything the United States had: 500-pound bombs, napalm, which burned out uselessly in the tree canopy, snake-eye bombs to strip the trees away first, then 1,000 and 2,000-pounders. On Hill 861 alone, the preparation ran to more than 2,000 artillery rounds and better than 500,000 pounds of ordnance. After a day and a half of that, as many as 75 of the bunkers were still intact. A squad leader from Company G said it was somewhat surprising. Every living thing on the hilltop had been blown away, the vegetation gone, the trees shattered to stubble, the ground unrecognizable to men who had stood on it days before. The bunkers were still there. 9 months later, engineers on that hill could not cut down the few trees left standing. The wood was so full of shrapnel that chainsaws would not go through it. Marines digging into the red clay kept striking masses of putrefied flesh. That is the ground. Now, the 30th of April. The terrain around the summit of Hill 881 South was so tight that the battalion could not attack the way Marines are trained to attack. 2 companies up, 1 in reserve. Not here. There was only one way in. Company M of the 3rd Marines, under Captain Raymond Bennett, would have to make the final assault on the hill alone. They walked into an entire battalion of the North Vietnamese Army's 18th Regiment. The artillery observer with them, Lieutenant David Rogers, could see no more than 5 bunkers. There were dozens, hundreds of fighting holes between them, machine gun lanes already cut through the grass, mortars already ranged on the ground the Marines were crossing. The company had walked past bunkers it never saw, into a kill zone. Then the hill fired on them from all sides, at under 100 meters, nothing to hide behind but grass and shell holes. 2nd Lieutenant Joseph Mitchell was wounded, kept fighting, and was killed. 2nd Lieutenant Billy Cruz was thrown into the air by a mortar round. He hit a tree trunk and came down 10 feet away, with broken ribs and shrapnel through his forearms, face, and neck. He woke up. He went back to it. Lance Corporal James Wisenant went forward alone. He killed a bunker with an M72 rocket, pushed on into the open, killed the men inside the next one. A machine gun cut him down. 8 hours. 44 Marines killed, 109 wounded. 27 of the dead were from Company M. The company was finished, pulled out to be rebuilt. 2 things happened that same day on the next hill over. While Company M was being destroyed on 881 South, Company G of the 2nd Battalion 3rd Marines was moving on Hill 881 North. A corporal named John Hayes watched one of his men, a lance corporal, 20 years old, named William Roldan. Roldan was crouched in front of an enemy bunker and, in Hayes's words, appeared to be having trouble with his weapon. He was in a kneeling position, working on it. He stayed in that one position long enough for a sniper to settle on him. Then he stood up. He was killed. A staff sergeant in that action, Ruben Santos, said the enemy had opened fire on them at 25 meters. Hold the picture still. A 20-year-old kneeling in the open, both hands on a rifle that will not clear, 25 meters from a bunker full of men who are shooting at him, not firing back, working, because the tool he needed was a steel rod, and the time he needed was time he did not have. 2 days later, the 2nd of May, still on 881 North, a corporal named Robert Torter took his squad forward. 9 riflemen made the assault. 6 of their rifles jammed, almost immediately. Torter reported it afterward in the flattest language a man can use. It slowed down our assault quite a bit, he said, as the enemy was able to pick off quite a few of my men. 10 of Torter's 13 men were dead or wounded within minutes. 6 rifles out of 9. That is not a rumor in a letter. That is a corporal's report inside the official history of the United States Marine Corps. A lieutenant at the battalion command post, Joe McDavid, wrote down what the aftermath looked like. We found dead Marines with broken down M16s as they tried to fix the jammed weapons. A week later, on the 9th of May, on 2 more hills, Company F of the same battalion hit the same wall. The history's words, enraged Marines found themselves at a disadvantage as their M16s jammed and could not be cleared. Hampered by malfunctioning rifles and poor communications, the company fought on, and the casualties mounted. The men knew exactly what was happening to them. One Marine after another came forward to say his rifle had jammed in a firefight, or worse, that he had watched friends die while they struggled to clear a round out of a chamber. Here is what they were told. They were told there was nothing wrong with the rifle. They were told they had not cleaned it properly or had not been trained on it well enough. General Walt said it. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Greene, said it. General Westmoreland was still saying it in his memoirs almost 10 years later. Now, here is the Marine Corps' own verdict on that, written by its own historians. It turned out that the troops were right and that the generals were partially right as well. The rifle did demand a standard of cleaning that was often impossible to meet in the field or in combat. Even when the rifle was cleaned perfectly, it often failed to properly eject spent cartridges, even when it was cleaned perfectly. That is the answer to the sentence in the Army's own publications. That is the answer to, an occasional cleaning will keep the weapon functioning indefinitely. By the time the hill fights ended, 155 Marines were dead and 425 were wounded. The men were not dirty. The rifle was broken. Broken by decisions made in a room, and no amount of scrubbing on a hillside was going to unmake them. The men on those hills did the only thing left to them. They wrote home. The letters went to parents, to friends, to newspapers, and some of them went to congressmen. In May of 1967, a representative from New Jersey named James Howard stood up on the floor of the House and read one of them aloud. An account of Marines found dead with their rifles stripped apart beside them. Be careful with those letters. The Marine Corps' historians are. Some of the complaints that reached congressmen were, in their words, clearly exaggerated. Men who have watched their friends die will not file a precise report, and they should not be asked to. It did not matter. You cannot unread something into the congressional record. What followed was the thing institutions fear most, which is not anger, it is subpoena power. The House Armed Services Committee formed a special subcommittee on the M16 rifle program, chaired by a Missouri congressman named Richard Ichord. It went to Vietnam. It interviewed hundreds of soldiers and Marines. It went through the contracts, the test files, the committee minutes, and the memoranda for the record. In October 1967, it published what it found. Start with what the investigators saw in the field, because it matches the hills exactly. Of the Marines they interviewed, roughly half had experienced a malfunction. Of those malfunctions, about 80% were failures to extract. The stuck case, the one that needs the rod. The rods themselves were carried disassembled in a case. A man in a firefight had to find the pieces and screw them together before he could begin. They also confirmed something worse, and quietly. A corporal was killed, they reported, while running up and down the line of his squad, pushing cartridges out of his men's rifles. He had the only cleaning rod in the squad. The subcommittee did not print that as a rumor. It printed it as confirmed by our investigation. They noticed something else, and honesty requires it be said. The Army units they visited were in far better shape. Those units cleaned before every patrol and after every patrol. One infantry company test-fired after coming in, and 2 rifles out of 154 failed. 2 out of 154 in units that had been taught to expect the worst. 6 out of 9 in a squad that had been told the rifle cleaned itself. That is the distance between the two services, measured in rifles. The Army had learned, which makes the 5th finding of the subcommittee the coldest sentence in the whole report. that the past experience of the Army with the M16 rifle in Vietnam was not properly called to the attention of the Marines when the weapon was issued to them. The Army knew what this rifle did. It had learned it the hard way, in the field, and had built the cleaning discipline to survive it. It handed the rifle to the Marine Corps without passing on the lesson. The subcommittee did not spare the Marine Corps either. It found commands in both services negligent in supervising the care of the rifle and in getting cleaning gear and written instructions into men's hands. That is in the record, and it belongs there. Only one of the two services already knew what was coming. Then the findings get worse. That the change from IMR powder to ball propellant in 1964 was not justified or supported by test data. That the major contributor to malfunctions experienced in Vietnam was ammunition loaded with ball propellant. That the rifle project manager, the contracting officer, the members of the Technical Coordinating Committee, and officials as high in authority as the Assistant Secretary of Defense knowingly accepted M16 rifles that would not pass the approved acceptance test. More than half the rifles would fail on cyclic rate if tested with both powders. Colt was allowed to test with IMR alone, at a time when the vast majority of ammunition in Vietnam was ball, knowingly accepted. There were reasons, of the kind that do not appear on a specification sheet. The subcommittee noted that Olin Matheson had enjoyed a sole source position on ball propellant for the Army for 26 years, and that this close relationship may have influenced the decision-makers at Army Munitions Command, Army Weapons Command, and Army Materiel Command. It asked the General Accounting Office to audit the contracts. It looked at the man who had commanded Army Weapons Command through the first M16 negotiations, Major General Nelson Lind. He approved the terms of that contract. 2 days before his retirement, he asked the Adjutant General for an opinion on a job offer from the parent company of Colt. He was working for them by that August. The subcommittee's finding on that ran to 3 words: at least unethical. Then, having laid all of it out, the subcommittee wrote this: the failure on the part of officials with authority in the Army to cause action to be taken to correct the deficiencies of the 5.56 millimeter ammunition borders on criminal negligence. Criminal negligence, not a grieving mother's phrase, not a reporter's, the considered language of a committee of the United States Congress reviewing the conduct of the United States Army in a printed government report. What happened to the men who made those decisions? Nothing that the public record shows. No one was fired. No one was court-martialed. No one was prosecuted. The subcommittee that used the words criminal negligence recommended audits, studies, and further testing. It did not recommend that a single human being be held to account. It explained why, in the finding that is the truest thing in the whole document, the manner in which the Army rifle program has been managed is unbelievable. The existing command structure was either inadequate or inoperative. The division of responsibility makes it almost impossible to pinpoint responsibility when mistakes are made. The division of responsibility makes it almost impossible to pinpoint responsibility when mistakes are made. That is not a bug in the system. That is the system working exactly as built. A rifle can be broken by 20 reasonable men in 3 rooms over 4 years. At the end of it, there is no one to court-martial. No single hand did it. The colonel was following direction. The committee concurred. The contractor met the specification it was given. The powder passed the test it was allowed to take, and a 20-year-old knelt in the open on Hill 881 North with both hands on a rifle that would not clear. They fixed the rifle. That part is true, and it deserves to be said plainly. The chrome plating went into the chamber so a hot case would stop fusing to bare steel. A heavier buffer slowed the action back toward the speed Stoner designed. Real cleaning kits went out. Real training went with them. Malfunction reports fell away, and the rifle that men cursed on those hills became a rifle they trusted. And then, a rifle the world copied. Now put the dates next to each other. The Plunger, the modification nobody outside the Army wanted, the one that shoves a stuck round deeper in, was forced in by Army direction in 1963. The chrome plating, the one change that attacked the actual killing mechanism, was approved on the 26th of May, 1967. The workaround in 1963, the fix in 1967. Delete the rule first, buy the workaround later. Roldan died on the 30th of April, 1967. The fix was approved 4 weeks after he died. It was not expected to reach production barrels until that autumn, delayed a further month by a strike at the Colt plant. No Marine on those hills ever held a chromed chamber. The fix had not even been approved when they died. They died waiting on a decision that had not been made yet. The powder was never withdrawn. It was reformulated in 1970 to cut the calcium carbonate down, 6 years after it went into service. 3 years after Congress called the failure to fix it criminal negligence. One of the subcommittee's own findings in the meantime was that the fouling characteristics of ball propellant would require continued emphasis on proper care and cleaning of the rifle, which is to say, the powder stays, the men clean more, and then the Army did the last thing. It had to teach hundreds of thousands of infantrymen to clean a rifle it had told them cleaned itself. It printed a comic book, DA Pamphlet 750-30, first issued in 1968, reissued the following year, 30 pages, drawn by Will Eisner, one of the great comic artists of the century, the man who helped invent the graphic novel. There is a blonde pinup in it, leaning over the disassembled parts, talking to the reader in slang. Chapter headings like, How to Strip Your Baby, and What to Do in a Jam. Sentences like, Worry a little more about your rifle, like, Baby it a bit. The second edition went out over the signature of General William Westmoreland, the same Westmoreland who was still writing, years later, that the trouble had been men not cleaning their rifles. The pamphlet's sponsoring agency was Army Materiel Command, the organization that had swallowed the Ordnance Corps back in 1962, at the start of all this. Across the bottom of the back cover, in red capitals, the Army printed the last word on the subject, because you bet your life on it. That is where it lands. About 8 million M16s built, by Colt's own count, in American service since 1964, more than 60 years. Carried by men who were not born when Hill 881 North was taken. A comic book printed a year too late, teaching them to do the thing they were once promised they would never have to do. They fixed the rifle. They never fixed the room. The room is still there, in some building, where a modification gets approved on the basis of direction, where a waiver gets extended 1 more month, where a test gets run with the good powder, because that is the powder that passes. Everyone in it doing something reasonable. Nobody in it able to see the hill. The rod is the picture that stays. A steel rod down the muzzle of the rifle that was never supposed to need one, in the hands of the dead on Hill 881 North. In the hands of a corporal running his squad's line with the only one they had. On page 5 of an Army comic book, under the heading, What to Do in a Jam, drawn as a joke for men who had already learned it the other way. If you want to go deeper, the vault where I keep the full script, the sources, and everything that did not make the final cut is linked in the description. Subscribe, and I will keep pulling these apart, one piece of gear at a time. If you want the story of the rifle that came before this one, the one the Army fought to keep, that is waiting for you in the playlist.